Welcome to Resolutions, a podcast about dispute resolution and prevention. This podcast is a project by the ABA section of Dispute Resolution to increase the avenues where we can connect. I'm Larry Schooler. One of four hosts serves as interlocutor, engaging in conversations with members of the dispute resolution community about topics of interest in the field. This week I'm sitting down with Jose Egurbide, a native Spaniard turned college football player, a Los Angeles prosecutor who has evolved into a zealous advocate for restorative justice. Jose shares more about his journey across the world and across the field of dispute resolution, with an important pit stop in the field of mindfulness. Well, Jose Egurbide, welcome to Resolutions. Great to have you.
Thank you, Larry. Thanks for having me.
When we were getting ready to start recording, we were talking about your last name, and that led us to a conversation about your origins. And I understand you were born elsewhere and made your way to the United States. Tell me a little bit about that journey to the U.S.
Yeah, thanks, Larry. So that's a great start because even though I am currently the chief of the criminal branch at the LA City Attorney's Office, and by most accounts, when I meet with criminal justice involved individuals in some of our diversion programs, they kind of look at me and they're like, "Oh, who's this middle-aged white guy, right?" But they don't know. They don't know my story, and oftentimes, we collectively don't know each other's personal stories and background, and what we've been through. For me, I can't say that I had a bad childhood, but I was born and raised in the Basque Country in Spain. I was born in Bilbao, and when I came here, I was 11 years old. I was going into sixth grade, and my dad was a professional highlight player. So we moved to the Northeast, and he got a contract to play at Bridgeport Highlight. And that was the first time I'd ever been to the United States. So I didn't speak.
Remember any of those first impressions?
Yes. So anybody that's ever been, traveled through Europe, we're a little bit more conservative. And certainly back in the mid 70s, when I moved from Spain to the US, it was like, I've tried to describe it to people as moving from a black and white movie to a multicolor, experience. I remember getting off the plane at JFK, and I was not used to grown men wearing lime green, shorts and tube socks with, white tube socks with, with different colored stripes. And so that in and of itself was like, whoa, quite a shift from Spain and, the area in Spain where I grew up, where grown men don't wear shorts unless they're at the beach.
You were talking about your dad's athleticism, and I know athletics came to become a fairly important part of your life. What led you down the path of college football?
Yeah, thanks for asking that, Larry. And to me, it was a way to fit in. And I think sometimes when you experience a lot of change early on, when I got to the U.S. Just because my name was Jose, not because I looked different, but because my name was Jose, I had an accent, I couldn't speak the language, I didn't have any cultural references. I really felt like outside looking in. And I think sports was, for me, a great bridge, a great way to sort of gap those differences, cultural and otherwise. And it certainly helped me to kind of stay on the right track. And eventually I got recruited to play football at I was being recruited by a number of schools and ended up at Yale University.
Which of course makes my heart swell to know that as it is my alma mater also. I know we're going to talk about your career in a second. Do you think that there were particular lessons that you were able to take away from being a college athlete that have applied to the work that you do today?
Yes, for sure. So Larry, I don't know if you know this, but just last week I went back east for my 35th year college reunion. And what was interesting was I was privileged to be able to speak to my colleagues as part of a panel on giving back to community. And in that panel, I talked about my Yale experiences. And I mentioned that the diversity at Yale was, readily, seen and felt. We had such a great diversity in that class, and I think Yale, has always been known for that. But we were also very fractured, and I think as a student athlete at a top academic university like Yale, sometimes I felt a little bit ostracized. That definitely, in addition to my experiences, my personal experiences I had when I first moved to the country, you know, made me feel sort of like when in an environment of insecure overachievers, I felt like an insecure underachiever. And I told my colleagues when I was speaking last week that when I was at Yale, I was really jealous of people that knew exactly what they wanted to do when they graduated and they had their career path already lined up. And I had no idea. So that added to this sense of insecurity. And, I really felt, within an environment like Yale, like I was just surviving, right? And I thought, well, I'll figure it out. But I've since talked to so many young men and women that experience the same thing. They have this sense of insecurity and this sense of self-doubt because they don't have all figured out. And so we'll talk about my career, but it was so nonlinear. And I eventually got to the right place. But at the time, I just felt I wasn't fully formed. I was very nervous. But eventually I figured it out.
Help me identify where along the journey, the practice of law entered into your field of vision, and what, if anything, kind of led it there. What got you interested in that?
Sure. So, like I mentioned, I really had no idea what I wanted to do once I graduated. I was very jealous of colleagues of mine that seemed to have it all mapped out. And so, I had some interviews, and I went to work for a company that really went into the sales and marketing industry. And I worked for this company out of Chicago. Did some work domestically in sales and sales support, and also got a chance to travel around and go down to Latin America, to Colombia, Venezuela, Chile, Uruguay, Mexico. Help one of our consultants set up distributorships throughout Latin America for our products, and so that was a great experience. But after 5 years of doing sales and marketing, domestic and internationally, I still was not fulfilled. And I knew that I wanted to go back to school. So it was a matter of like, am I going to go back to business school or law school? And I chose law school. And so that's when I enrolled at Pepperdine Law School.
And when you were in law school, kind of where did you see your career taking you, or what within the broader ecosystem of law drew you in?
Yeah, that is the non fully formed sort of effect continued in law school. There were some folks that they were like, I want to be a judge, or I want to pursue like the private sector, and I was still trying to figure it out. I went into it thinking I wanted to get into international law, until I realized how small that field is. And it's really just domestic lawyers practicing for a large multinational. And when I came out, I realized, well, I love sales. I loved presentations. I felt that I had a presence in moot court, and I really enjoyed that type of work. So eventually somebody that I knew said, you would be a great prosecutor, and so there was an opportunity for me to apply at the Los Angeles City Attorney's Office. And, here I am 27 years later. So I went from law school to the City Attorney's Office, started there, and I've stayed there my entire career as a lawyer. The largest prosecutorial agency in the county is the district attorney's office, and they handle all juvenile matters, all felony matters, and all adult misdemeanor matters outside the city of LA. And then within the city of Los Angeles, the city attorney's office is a dual function office that has jurisdiction criminally over all adult misdemeanor crimes.
I know that the session that you gave at the conference was very popular, very well attended. And so there may be a number of listeners who are already familiar with the journey you took from traditional prosecution to restorative justice. But I also think there could be some listeners who still don't even know what we mean when we say restorative justice. So perhaps start there, if you would, even to include how you get introduced to it, and how you sort of think about what it means.
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of lawyers go through sort of an evolution. When we start out as a young lawyer in court, especially for prosecutors or public defenders, it's all about getting into court, doing a trial. And, for me as a young prosecutor, trying to get as much courtroom experience as I could, rack up a bunch of jury trials. And, and while that's certainly how I felt when I first started, there's a feeling that sinks in, even though relatively speaking, misdemeanors, they're only punishable up to a year in jail. And I say only, relative to felonies where you're really, somebody's life could be at stake. So the stakes are lower, but you're still dealing with, you're dealing with individuals, you're dealing with people's lives. And so you shift, at some point in your career, you realize, hey, there's individuals behind these files, both on the victim side and on the offender side. There are personal stories, and there are reasons why these individuals ended up in this situation. And so you shift from this very transactional mode that maybe you start off as, and then get into a more, at least for me, a mode where I really wanted to see if there was any way to have a transformational effect. Most prosecutors think about public safety as the guiding goal. But here in this office, and certainly under my current city attorney, Mike Fuhrer, our focus has been on reducing recidivism as much as it is. Of course, you want public safety, you want to enhance public safety, but if you can reduce recidivism, the rate of reoffense by criminal justice involved individuals, then that's really a win for everybody, right? And so I guess that's my long-winded way of saying that somewhere along the way, I shifted from this transactional mode to a transformation mode.
I guess one thing I'm wondering about is the way in which you perceive restorative justice to be changing in the public imagination. And I ask that in part because in the work that I've done with policing, you certainly see this fairly roller coaster-ish kind of ride here, where obviously in the summer of 2020, we saw this sort of cataclysm and national reckoning around how policing is done. And here in the last, several months, you've started to see municipal budgets for policing go up, and concerns about crime rates rising go up. And so I know in my exposure to restorative justice, you always hear the whispers of, the shorthand might be soft on crime, or, touchy feely, or, the things that are very stereotypical and not really accurate at all. But I am curious, kind of, when you talk about this either with colleagues or with others in the criminal justice system in one form or another, how are their reactions? What do they say about this form of your practice?
So it is. I think that you have some folks that are very well informed, and others that do look at it very cautiously, or with a sort of a critical eye, like is this soft on crime, like you said. You have everything in between. I think if you ask 10 different people what restorative justice means, you'll get 10 different definitions. And so, for me, I think that because of my growth mindset, and I'm just like a curious individual. Um, I was, I feel like I was practicing restorative justice even before I knew what restorative justice was. But when I was challenged by my current boss back in 2014 to develop a restorative justice based prosecutor led diversion program, that's when I did a deep dive. As lawyers, that's what we do, right? We just, we get an assignment and it's like you research it and you find out all about it. And I was like, oh wow, like I feel like I've been doing this already. And so, I think my sense of empathy and compassion for others, which was all based out of my personal experiences, um, you know, made made for sort of a great subject in me to start implementing restorative justice on a sort of office wide level, because of a couple of particular experiences that I had had, not necessarily related to my cases, but where these experiences kind of shaped this idea of transformation and how it can come about.
And I think I've been remiss in, again, assuming that a listener knows exactly what we mean when we say restorative justice. So if, for example, I've been charged with a crime that fits into your office's jurisdiction, and I then become eligible for this kind of what you're calling a diversion program, what am I going to experience? What is that like?
Right. So let's back up and fill in some blanks. Traditional prosecution is mostly looked at from the lens of you have a crime and then a corresponding punishment, right? And I think that most of our listeners can appreciate that over the years, whether we've been overly punitive or not so much, that would be the traditional criminal justice process. Restorative justice takes a different look at that crime and punishment. And so what they do is they change that lens slightly, and instead of the crime and the corresponding punishment, they're looking at what harm was caused and whose responsibility is it to fix it. And so by looking at it in terms of the harm and the repair or the restoration, you're really you're not so focused on, okay, this concept of punishment, right? Or sending someone to a penitentiary. The word itself has like religious connotations, right? You're going to be sent somewhere where you're going to be placed in isolation. You're going to think about, that you were a bad person, and somehow that's going to magically make you come out and be a better member of society. I think our listeners will appreciate that definition, but also the understanding that restorative justice is an idea that is not new. It's thousands of years old, and it comes from pre-colonial cultures, and even before that, tribal cultures, of making sure that when a member of a tribe committed a wrong against the tribe, that they were not just automatically kicked off the tribe. As you can imagine, in small tribal cultures, if you did that, you'd soon end up being a tribe of one. And, that was not to the benefit of the tribe. And so this concept that no member of the tribe is, it should be kicked out or thrown away, I think is a main concept of restorative justice, that we need every member of society is important. And the other concept, I think, that's oftentimes missed, Larry, and perhaps you've had this experience, is the idea that restorative justice has to start with this concept of accountability. So when folks say, oh, it's soft on crime, well, not necessarily. It is if you decriminalize and decarcerate, and then the alternative is zero accountability. But that's not restorative justice. And so to the extent that that's what's happening in different places, and there's no either individual or systems accountability, then that's not truly restorative. And I think that's an important point to make in this conversation.
And, there also, I think, is a perception amongst some that for the offender, the chances of punishment are either significantly reduced as it relates to severity, or maybe even eliminated from the vantage point of, incarceration or something like it. I guess what I wonder about from your vantage point is, how do you convince all of the different parties, so to speak, to this criminal matter that this is something that is worth all of their whiles, not just the offender, but the victim and others impacted by the alleged activity?
No, that's a great question, Larry, because there's a proportionality aspect to that really matters, and that is, this idea that you have to find a sweet spot in order to have transformation, and so whatever the engagement plan is, or whatever the sort of response, the restorative justice response is, needs to be proportional to the offense. You can't overburden or underburden an offender. And so if you have a relatively minor crime, it may be okay to say, well, as part of your engagement, you should write an apology letter to the retailer where you stole the goods from, or you should write a reflection essay and think about, what is it that I could have done differently, to make sure that, there's a different outcome in the future. And then maybe perhaps have that individual also give back to the community by working in an environment where, the same environment that they stole from, so that they can see that these individuals work hard, that these businesses are necessary for the neighborhood, so that also creates a greater sense of empathy on the part of the offender towards the victims, right? And that's fine for petty crimes. But as you get higher and higher up in the severity of crimes, there may be a punitive aspect that is woven into the response. I think oftentimes people think that restorative justice is only for like small crimes, or that a punishment-based approach and a restorative approach cannot coexist, and that's just not so. Oftentimes, you see state prisoners that have their aha moment, if you will, in terms of restorative justice when they're participating in circles within the prison, and it's only in that context when they start seeing that other inmates are opening up, becoming vulnerable, if you will, and sharing their stories of survival, that they really get, this deep dive into their individual trauma, and they're able to overcome it and come out the other side. So, those are very powerful sort of points that I think, when you speak to people on the streets, the concept of, soft on crime, or the concept that, punishment approach and a restorative approach cannot coexist, or, concepts like that, the proportionality concept, the emphasis on accountability. I think those are all things that are important ingredients in making sure that a restorative approach is successful.
I guess I'm also curious, though, about the pitch, so to speak, to those who've been, victimized, because I read an article this morning about a family incensed by the sentence imposed upon a drunk driver who was responsible for the deaths of their loved ones. Obviously, that happens all the time, and it's not to do with restorative justice per se. But I can imagine a family member, for example, or even the victim, her or himself, saying, Jose, I want you to throw the book at this person. I want you to, give them the maximum punishment. What is the way that you approach their concerns or connect with their issues?
Yeah, that's I'll tell you that on the lower end of sort of the criminal offenses, it's harder to convince a victim to participate because sometimes they think, look, my insurance covers the loss, and this is just like you're punishing me twice by making me attend this, this circle to discuss what happened. But I think certain victims, it boils down to their needs, right? And I think you appreciate that, in mediation, oftentimes we're dealing about pecuniary interests of one party versus the other. But sometimes the interesting work is when you move from those interests to the needs. What are the needs of, one party versus the other in mediation? And in restorative justice, it's the same thing. It's just instead of a mediator, you have a facilitator, but it's still a third party neutral that guides this structure conversation and tries to get at, okay, victim, what are your needs? And how can we provide, an opportunity for you to get those needs met? Victims need to regain their sense of control. They need to, sometimes they need to vent to the offender, because they feel victimized. And so their needs are very different than the offenders. The offender sometimes needs to express their apology, a sincere apology. They maybe have a need to be forgiven for what they did. Maybe they have a need to be heard, to have someone understand what is going on with them, beyond just that crime, but what is happening with them in their lives, right? And so I think it's not so much the pitch as much as it's really trying to find out from the victim's perspective and the offender's perspective, get them to articulate almost in a motivational interviewing way, get them to say to us, why do you think this would be a benefit to you? Shift it on them, put it on them so that there's ready buy-in and both sides are ready to participate in a meaningful way.
You talked at the outset about a desire to reduce recidivism, that is sort of a top of mind goal across the entire organization, much less this particular program. What kind of data do you have to show you that this work is doing what you want it to do?
Yeah, the data, initially, we talked to a lot of academics, and we were struggling with the academics' need for almost having like A, B, A, B, A, B, right? And kind of a random sort of test of, how does this cohort group, perform versus this one. Within prosecution, obviously that idea is a little bit difficult for us because we can't selectively prosecute. We can't say, okay, criminal justice involved individual A, you go through diversion, but then, individual B, we're going to prosecute. So the next best thing that we could do was go back and look at our data prior to the establishment of our prosecutor-led diversion, this restorative process. And so what we did was pre-2014, look at individuals that were demographically matched to a random number of participants, and then look at this random number of criminal defendants that we filed charges against, we prosecuted them, we placed them on probation, and then how well did they perform after that? 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 24 months after their sentence was imposed, what was their rate of reoffense? And then we looked at a random number of participants in the program, again, demographically matched, age, gender, charges, etc. And so we looked at how well did they perform after going through a process where we were supportive of their participation. We let them know that this was an opportunity to talk about root causes, to try to address them, give them some supportive services. And then by agreement, they also agreed to have their criminal history run in 6, 12, 18, and 24-month intervals after successful completion. And when we looked at the numbers, we were seeing 5 to 7 times lower recidivism rates by the individuals that we put through this prosecutor-led pre-filing diversion program. So not only better outcomes, Larry, but also intercepting these cases at before they even enter the criminal justice system. So a system savings, but also a more transformational outcome where these individuals were actually modifying their behavior in a way that they were not if we punish them.
You know, it occurs to me as we're talking about this that obviously we're doing it in the context of the field of dispute resolution, and you referenced parallels between what a mediator may do for two parties in conflict and what a facilitator in a restorative justice setting may do. And I certainly, as both a professional and as an academic, view restorative justice along a spectrum or a menu, if you will, of options in dispute resolution. At the same time, I guess it occurs to me that the scenario is so different in certain ways from what two parties who come to mediation, for example, might be seeking. And we've often heard the phrase victim offender mediation, but I'm challenged by that just because there's not exactly the same sort of standing for both parties there. You know, there are criminal charges pending, perhaps. I guess I wonder, given that, you know, you made this presentation to the conference, we're talking here, where do you see restorative justice fitting into the broader ecosystem of dispute resolution, and maybe where does it stand out? Where does it differ?
Yeah, I think you're right on that. It's this power dynamic that is different in most traditional mediation settings than it is in a victim offender mediation. So it's almost like a misnomer, right? Because you do have a power imbalance. One was clearly the victim and one was clearly the offender, whereas in some mediations, again, you have two parties that are more or less on equal footing and they're just trying to resolve a conflict, right? And so I think that's a very astute observation, and one that kind of drives not only the future of restorative justice, and regardless of what modality you use, but also mediators' role in the future of restorative justice. Because like in mediations, you need a neutral third party that is capable of maintaining a psychologically safe space. That's so critical. And I think mediators, by and large, are, they have all those skills to do so, and to practice appreciative listening, and to reflect back what they're hearing from either side. And so they have all the tools to step in and facilitate a circle discussion. Now, where it's different is, like you said, within that circle, there are certain needs that the offender has, that the victim has. Maybe you have several members of the community that are also part of this circle, and they're there to kind of, if we don't have a victim that shows up to the panel discussion, they're there as proxy victims, and so they speak on behalf of the victim and the community with the offender. And the mediators that we're using in our programs, we bring them from our dispute resolution program. So we bring them into our restorative justice arena, but they're already seasoned veterans in traditional community mediation. And so it's very helpful for us to have these seasoned veterans stepping into this restorative space. Then all we need to do is really, give them a primer on restorative justice, and that, we're not there to judge the offender. We're not there to talk about the crime itself, and to really, get them to understand that we're trying to dive into the root causes, and that if we can successfully touch on those and start addressing those, then that's what leads to the transformation, not necessarily a discussion about, what happened the day of the offense, right?
Yeah, it's a fascinating space, I think, for those of us who, practice dispute resolution, to find ourselves in, and to hold space for someone who, may be on the verge of taking accountability for something we as the neutral have feelings about. I think creates some remarkable dynamics. One other thing on restorative justice before I turn to just a couple of other quick things. Part of what you read about the Los Angeles program that you helped to birth is its sort of notability or its significance nationally. And my observation has been that restorative justice has more quickly gained traction in countries other than the United States. I'm curious whether you see it the same way. And if so, what's going on there, do you think? Where is any resistance or slowness in making some of the necessary paradigm shifts coming from?
I do feel that there are some countries that, as a matter of as a national priority, they've adopted restorative justice or restorative justice principles into their frameworks. I think maybe it's a little more challenging here in the United States with different states and different, municipalities and counties, coming up with their own strategies, and they're not always in lockstep with each other, right? So again, I think you have a lot of great energy and great projects throughout the country, but there isn't like a unifying or a uniting set of guiding principles. It takes me back, because before I started teaching restorative justice at Pepperdine, I got to meet sort of the teacher that I was replacing, Daniel Van Ness. And Daniel Van Ness is he's a scholar and a practitioner on restorative justice. He's an amazing guy. So when I first heard, oh, this is the guy that I'm replacing, I was like, oh, I he helped draft some of the restorative justice principles for the United Nations, and I was like, I'm supposed to replace this guy, and I was feeling very nervous until I talked to him, and he said, Jose, your experience at the LA City Attorney's Office as a practitioner is something that is very different than talking theory or theoretical restorative justice and different models. And he told me, the stuff that you're doing is how restorative justice is going to sort of change, in the United States. How it's adopted into the criminal justice system. You're right in the middle of it, and it's very different than just talking about the history of RJ or, just talking about it from an academic's perspective. And so he went a long way to make me feel, more comfortable about it. And I said, well, I'm still going to use your textbook.
Surely there are a number of folks who have been giving thought to the intersection between our work and the field of mindfulness. Of course, I'm sure you've occasionally been told that you practice meditation and not mediation. I certainly have. But can you briefly share with us a little bit about the way that you have seen mindfulness intersect with some of the work that we've been talking about that you're doing?
So, for me, it was kind of a personal and then professional experience. And so I had, my older sister, who was only a year and a half older than me, passed away in 2017. As a result of that, I did some personal work on trauma, and that personal work led me to explore mindfulness. And so the way I did it was the only way I know how, which is, I grabbed a book from a friend's shelf. It was called Search Inside Yourself. And, I looked up the author, I called them, I hounded him. His assistant put me in touch with his nonprofit, the Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute. And then through a series of other events, I ended up in front of their CEO, Rich Fernandez. And I started talking to him about, hey, what you guys are doing is great. I mean, I think that, this whole mindfulness movement that was birthed at Google, and now this nonprofit that is now, teaching mindfulness to sort of Silicon Valley companies. That's great. But, how about thinking about mindfulness in the public arena, in the public sector, and trying to promote the use of mindfulness to help criminal justice involved individuals modify their own behavior. And I was challenging them on this because I saw it work so well with me, and I was thinking, well, again, relatively speaking, my level of trauma is nothing, but the ability to have these tools to sort of self-modulate, even like, at midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning when you get triggered and there's nobody else around, to help you. I thought, wow, this would be a great set of tools to teach our young offenders, especially, our 18 to 25-year-old criminal justice involved individuals that maybe have never had an outlet before this on how to, really deal with these emotional triggers that they're experiencing. So that was my, my sort of aha moment in terms of mindfulness. I learned about it personally, then I saw the applications professionally, and then I started just moving towards how can I get this introduced into our criminal justice system.
That is something I would like to see up close and personal someday, I can tell you. Jose Egurbide, thank you very much for this rich and thought-provoking conversation. We appreciate it.
Absolutely, Larry.
That was Jose Egurbide discussing his evolution as a prosecutor into the fields of restorative justice and mindfulness. Thanks for joining us for Resolutions. I'm Larry Schooler.